Hello and welcome everybody to this video where I'm going to show you how you can take an existing Relay project that is written with Relay Classic and you convert it and migrate it to use Relay Modern. That is the new Relay version that Facebook released at F8 2017. Alright, for the migration we are going to use an example project that you can find in the GraphQL examples GitHub organization, and that's the React Relay to-do example. This example repository has two relevant branches for this video. The first one is the modern branch that I'm on right now, and then we also have the classic branch that we'll use as the starter code for the migration. And for the migration, we're actually going to follow the documentation that Facebook provides. So they released this conversion playbook along with Relay Modern, and that helps you migrate your projects step by step to the new Relay API instead of having one huge migration where things can go wrong. So effectively, what you can do with this conversion playbook is you gradually upgrade your code to use the new APIs while the whole project will still continue working. Hello and welcome everybody to this video where I'm going to show you how you can take an existing Relay project that is written with Relay Classic and you convert it and migrate it to use Relay Modern. That is the new Relay version that Facebook released at F8 2017. Alright, for the migration we are going to use an example project that you can find in the GraphQL examples GitHub organization, and that's the React Relay to-do example. This example repository has two relevant branches for this video. The first one is the modern branch that I'm on right now, and then we also have the classic branch that we'll use as the starter code for the migration. And for the migration, we're actually going to follow the documentation that Facebook provides. So they released this conversion playbook along with Relay Modern, and that helps you migrate your projects step by step to the new Relay API instead of having one huge migration where things can go wrong. So effectively, what you can do with this conversion playbook is you gradually upgrade your code to use the new APIs while the whole project will still continue working. So on the left side in my terminal, I'm currently in the root directory of the project. So if I run the app using yarn start, and open localhost in my browser, we'll be able to see the current version of the application, which is a simple to-do app where we can see a list of to-dos, we can add new to-dos to the list, and we can change the completed status of our to-dos, and of course we can also go ahead and delete our to-dos. So it's a typical CRUD example with a to-do model, and this is what we're going to build and migrate to the new Relay API in this video. The first thing that we have to do, according to the conversion playbook, is installing the latest version of Relay. And for that, we can check the Relay started guide to see the commands that we're going to use for that. And the first thing we have to do is to add the development branch of React Relay to our repository. So I'm adding the dependency. So I'm effectively upgrading the already existing Relay dependency from the old one to the new one. And then one really convenient feature of the Relay migration is that we can actually go ahead and still make use of all the former Relay APIs simply by changing our import statements to import from React Relay to React Relay/Classic. So this part of the package still contains all the old Relay APIs, so that this simple change in our application, even after upgrading to the new Relay, will make for that our application still continues working. So while we're waiting for the installation of the new Relay dependency, I can already go ahead in the code to update our import statements. So I'll do a global search in my project and search for all imports of React Relay. And now I'm simply going ahead and changing all the occurrences to import from Relay Classic. All right, so these were all the occurrences of React Relay. In the meantime, the installation should have finished. So if we restart our packager now, it should be possible to just see the app in the state that it was before. So here we have our to-do app, and as before we can mark existing to-dos as completed, or we can delete them, and of course we can also go ahead and add new to-dos to our list. Alright, so even though we updated our relay dependency in the project, we can still use all the functionality that we had in the project before simply by changing our import statement to import from React Relay /classic. All right, let's move on with the conversion. The next step is to update our Babel plugin relay. And actually, this is the build step that we have to integrate that Relay uses to validate your GraphQL code against your actual schema. And with the new Relay version, there is a new plugin for Babel that is called Babel plugin relay instead of Babel relay plugin. Let's go ahead and add this dependency to our project. The next step that we then have to do is to add the relay step to the list of our plugins in our Babel configuration file. So let's go ahead and do that next. Open our Babel configuration file and replace the current relay invocation with the one that we need right now from the new Babel plugin relay. And in the documentation, you can actually have a bit more information about how you can integrate this plugin. And in fact, we also want to pass more options to this plugin, and that is we want to tell it that we're currently in compatibility mode, so the Compat flag will be set to true. And then we also have to specify a path to our GraphQL schema. And that's what we're going to do next. So right now, let's go ahead and update our plugin first. Looks like this. And the next step is that we need a schema.graphql file. And right now we don't have that kind of schema, but luckily we can download it, or we can use a tool that is called get GraphQL schema. You can simply install this one using npm install -g get GraphQL schema, and then you're passing the endpoint of your GraphQL URL, and you can write the output to a file called schema.graphql. And that's what I'm going to do right now. So first, let me go ahead and copy the GraphQL endpoint that we're using. So I'm copying that from the app.js file. Now I'm opening the terminal again, where I'm going to use the get GraphQL schema command. Pasting in the endpoint and making sure that the output is written to a file called schema.graphql. Let's convince ourselves that this file has been created. So right here in my IDE, we now see the whole GraphQL schema file, and that not only includes the data model, but it also includes every mutation and every query that we can actually use in our GraphQL API. The next step for us is to integrate the Relay compiler into our project. So notice that with Relay Modern, Relay has been split up into 3 different packages where it only before was 1. So the three new packages are the Relay compiler, that is basically a generic utility for parsing and optimizing GraphQL code, and it's also responsible for generating code artifacts. Then we've got the Relay runtime, which is a view library agnostic generic utility for writing, sending, and caching GraphQL data. So now you can actually go and use Relay with different view libraries other than React. But then you also have the React Relay package, which integrates React with Relay and provides the container API that you're supposed to use when you're using React with Relay. So let's go ahead and add the Relay compiler dependency to our project next. Here is the command that we can use to pull in this dependency. I'll just add it in the terminal, and we're installing the Relay compiler. The Relay compiler can then be invoked using this command, and since we're going to use this command rather often, it's also worth to add this as a build script to our package.json file. So let's go ahead and do that next. I'll open package.json and add a new script right here. And now is also the time for us to update the path to the schema.graphql file. So since the file is in the same directory as the package.json, this is the path. And in the .babel.rc file, we also set the path correctly. With the GraphQL schema file and the compiler, the Relay compiler in our project, we can now actually go ahead and move to the next step of our conversion. And that is to incrementally convert to the Relay Compat API. So the Relay Compat API is an intermediate API that we can use, again, for incrementally adopting Relay Modern in our project. So the first thing that we are going to do is to convert all our React components where we are currently using Relay create container. So rather than using the relay.createContainer function, we actually have to change that to using create fragment container. So we've got the to-do and the to-do list and to-do app components that are all making use of the relay create container at the moment. And we could do this conversion by hand, but Facebook also released a couple of conversion scripts that can be used for that purpose. So using the tool called JS CodeShift and a specific transformation file, you can actually go ahead and make this conversion automatically. And that's what we're going to do now. So let's move over to the terminal again. I already installed JS CodeShift on my computer, and I also already have the transformation files downloaded on my machine. Heading back over to the terminal, let's use JS CodeShift to convert our files. And we're invoking JS CodeShift, passing in our migrate to modern transformation file that we downloaded from the Relay Code Mod repository. And then we're also passing in all the files that we want to be converted. And in this case, this is all the JavaScript files that we have in the components directory at the moment. If we are invoking the Relay compiler, the Relay conversion right now, it's actually not going to work. And that's just because of a slight bug in the JS CodeShift or in the transformation files, that this only works if the import statement for Relay in the component has a semicolon in the end. So let's fix that real quick. And all the components that we expect to be converted will need a semicolon in the end. All right, so now let's re-invoke JS CodeShift. And now we expect the 3 files to be changed. We see that 3 files have been changed. One is unmodified, that is okay. That is the to-do text input component that we don't actually need to convert because it's not using the create container function. but for all the other components, we actually see that the relay part has been changed. So rather than using relay.createContainer, we're now using the createFragmentContainer function, and we also see that the fragments have been updated. So we're not using getFragments anymore, but rather every fragment actually has its own name. So we have all the fragments in a global namespace, which really eases up static analysis of our GraphQL code actually. So this is also an advantage for build tools that want to work with GraphQL. And the naming convention for the fragments that have been generated are such that the first part is the name of the file, and the second part is the name of the specific fragment. So this to-do and this to-do viewer fragments, they refer to the to-do and the viewer fragment in the to-do file, so to this and to this fragment specifically. At this point, we can go and use the Relay compiler for the first time, because we now are using the new API. So the compiler, if we invoke it now, it will generate the new components, the new containers for us. So let's go ahead and simply invoke yarn relay. So this will invoke the script in the package.json that we've set up before. And we see that 4 new files are being created for our components. And these files will be stored on our file system in a directory called generated, and this is where the Relay compiler puts all the files that it creates. So now that we've converted all our components to use the createFragmentContainer function, we can now do the same change with our mutations. So with the mutations, we actually have a bigger change because the whole pattern, how we define mutations with Relay Modern, has changed compared to Relay Classic. So let's start actually with the remove to-do mutation right here and see what that conversion process looks like. So first of all, I'm going to put a comment on all the existing code because we might need some of it later on. The way how mutations work with Relay Modern is actually quite different than it was before in the previous Relay version. In fact, the way how it works right now is by using a new function that is called commit mutation. So into that function, we're passing an environment, and we'll see later what exactly we have to pass in for that. And then we are also passing in an object where we're describing what the mutation should do and what it should look like. And in there, we can reuse some of the information that we used in the previous remove to do mutation already. Another thing that we have to do is to update the import up here. So this time we need to import the commit mutation function, as well as the GraphQL function from the React Relay Compat path. And we don't need the old import anymore. Let's now go back to the object that we have to pass into the commit mutation function. And in fact, the first thing that we have to pass in is just a description of the mutation in regular GraphQL syntax. And so this basically combines the two methods, or the information from the two methods that we saw before. On the one hand, the get mutation method from the from the previous remove to do mutation, as well as the get fed query method. So the information that's contained in there, we now have to write and specify specifically in a mutation that we're passing in. So here we are using GraphQL syntax to write our mutation, and we're using the GraphQL function that we are importing from React Relay. So this is what the mutation looks like. Notice that there are a few minor differences compared to the get fed query. So here for the get fed query, for example, we had the viewer and then only the all to dos field nested inside the viewer. And here we are actually spelling out what we want to have from the all to dos. And that's because in the fed query function, by default, all subfields of a specific field were included, but this is not the case anymore when we're using regular GraphQL syntax. So now we have to spell out all the fields that we actually want to have returned in the payload by the server. So now we have to simply take this mutation and pass it and put it as the first piece of information into the object that we're passing to commit mutation. The second property that we have to add to this object is the variables. And here we can actually go ahead and make use of the information that we saw below as well. So the variables that we specify right here will be passed as variables into the mutation. So this input, and specifically the information in this input object, will be the information that is required up here. And we know that for this mutation, we actually only need the to-do ID, but we're going to spell it out a little bit differently here, and that is by simply passing in the to-do ID that we receive as an input argument to our commit function, like this. And then the second variable that we have to pass here, and that currently is only because a minor limitation in the GraphQL API where the client mutation ID is a required parameter. And here it's really not important what string we pass, it's only important that we send it along, because Relay Modern won't send the client mutation ID automatically anymore. So if you have a GraphQL server where the client mutation ID is required to perform a mutation, you'll have to do this kind of workaround for now to make sure that the server still accepts your mutations. The next step is telling Relay how we wanted to update the store after the mutation was performed. And in fact, with Relay Modern, we can do that in two different ways. So the first way is the traditional way, using the get config or the configuration mutators that we could also use in Relay Classic already. But then there actually was a new way of updating the store introduced with Relay Modern. And that is by providing an updater function where we can simply directly access the store and modify the contents of the store in a very direct and imperative manner. But since we already have the configs from the previous mutation, we can simply go ahead and use the information in there. We only have to make a few small adjustments to the whole code in here. So actually I can go ahead and copy this part and we'll adjust it to our needs. So first we have to make this method a free function. And because now we don't have access to the props right here anymore, and we don't know the viewer ID in this context, we have to pass it in as an argument to this function. And lastly, we can also add the information to this object how we want the optimistic response that Relay is going to create for us should work. And that we can implement by, again, just implementing a function where we specify that information. We provide the deleted ID, that's the ID of the to-do that was deleted, and the viewer ID, and both of these we're passing in as arguments to the getOptimisticResponse function up here. So the way how we're going to use this now is by calling the to put in a new property in our mutation configuration object down here. The key for that new field is optimistic response, and then we're passing in a call to the getOptimisticResponse function that we just wrote. We're now done with the conversion of the remove to do mutation. We can now actually go ahead and delete the code from the previous mutation, and let's go and update all the remaining mutations as well. This time I already prepared the code, so let's start with the change to do status mutation that we're going to update like so. we're taking a very similar approach. We're taking the getConfigs method, making a free function out of it, passing in the information that we need inside. Same for the getOptimistic response. And then we call commit mutation down here, pass in the mutation that we specified, the variables that this mutation expects, the configs, and the optimistic response function. We've got 2 mutations left, so let's do the create to do mutation next. Again, we're specifying the whole mutation, including the payload that we want to be executed by the server. We've got the getOptimistic response function, the getConfigs function, and then finally, again, we're calling the commit mutation function, passing in the environment and the data that is expected by the mutation. So the last one that we have to do now is the rename to do mutation. And this one looks like this. Again, the mutation, the payload, getConfigs, getOptimistic response, and down here, the commit function that we're going to export. So now we can go and use the relay compiler again and see what it's going to generate based on the mutations that we now converted. I'm just calling yarn relay in the terminal again. And this time we see that it took our 4 new mutation functions and it generated new files based on the information that we provided there. And in fact, because we're not yet done with our conversion, we actually have to adjust the import statement a little bit to make sure that the code still works with our current relay runtime. So rather than importing from React Relay, we're importing from React Relay Compat everywhere. At this point, we can go and try to run our application again. So let's head back to the terminal and call yarn start again. But we're actually going to see that the application is not going to work in the state that it is now. And the reason for that is, let's go ahead and reload the page, is that the change to do status mutation here is throwing an issue for the get fragment. And we can fix that by just updating the code for our containers. So we have to go into our React components and make sure that we're only including fragments that actually exist. And the reason why we get the error is because we're still including fragments from our mutations, but with the new mutation API, we don't need this anymore because mutations now don't explicitly declare their own data dependencies anymore. So we simply can remove the mutations right here, save the app, make sure that in all our other components we're not using any fragments from the mutations anymore either. Save the file, reload the page, and here we see our list of to-dos again. However, at this point we still cannot actually use the mutations that we wrote. So right now if we try to add a new to-do to our list, or to change the status of an existing one, or to delete an existing one, we'll always get this error in the console stating that relay is not defined. And that's because we're not actually using the new mutations that we wrote, but instead we're still using the old mutation using the relay.store commit update API. So let's go ahead and change that now. And in here, we are actually going to use the change to do status mutation. So the way how we're going to use it is by simply calling commit on the change to do status mutation object that we're importing right here. And the change to do status mutation expects 4 arguments. The first one is the environment, then the to-do that we want to update, the new completed status, and the viewer ID. So let's provide this information. The environment we can actually go and incorporate easily using the props of our component where it is injected. The second one is the to-do. So here we can simply pass in the to-do that we get from our for each loop. Then we had to pass in the new completed status. So that's the new status right here. And finally, the viewer ID that we can access again through the props. We can also delete the code that we used before. And then we have to do the same for the create to do mutation up here. So we're following a similar approach. We're calling commit on the create to do mutation. And the arguments that we have to pass in first, again, the environment. Then the second argument this time is the text of the new to-do that is being created. We're passing in false as the default value for the completed status. And then lastly, again, we have to pass in the viewer ID for this mutation. The other mutations that we update all are in the to-do component. So this time we're going to do it a little bit faster, starting with the handle complete change mutation up here. Next, we update the rename to-do mutation, following the same pattern again. And the remove to-do mutation is the last one that we need to update in our to-do component. Let's now move to the next step of the conversion playbook. And that is to introduce the query renderer. And in fact, with this step, we actually have to go and replace our usage of the relay root container with an instance of the query renderer. So we're currently using only one relay root container in our app, and that is in the app.js file, where we are using it as the root element to be rendered. So here, instead, we now have to use an instance of the query renderer that looks as follows. This is the query renderer where we have to pass in an environment. And right now we don't have an environment yet. So what we have to do instead is just to pass in a relay store as long as we're still using the old relay runtime. Then we're providing the root query that effectively corresponds to the viewer route that we had before. So we can take that one away. And then we also provide the render method similar to what we did with the relay container. One thing that we still have to keep at the moment is this inject network layer on the relay object, because here is where we configure the GraphQL endpoint. Once we completely remove the old relay environment from the old relay API and replace it with a new relay static environment, we have to configure that new environment with our GraphQL endpoint. Right now, we can still use the old configuration for that. We also have to adjust the imports in the app.js file. So since we're not using the route and the root container anymore, we can simply delete these parts. And instead, we're going to import the query renderer and the GraphQL function from React Relay Compat. There we go. We're now ready for the next step in the conversion playbook, and that is to actually introduce the Relay Modern runtime by creating a relay static environment. For that, we're going to create a new file in our project that we're going to call create relay environment. And in there, we're going to put the following code. Let's walk our way from the bottom up. So we're exporting a new environment object. We're passing in a network object and a store. And the store we can simply create using a record source and then calling the store constructor. And for the network, we have to pass in a function that is returning a promise that is configured to run against our GraphQL endpoint. So that basically this is the foundation for all the GraphQL calls that are going to be made throughout the runtime of our app. And we configure it with our GraphQL endpoint. We can also pass some headers that we want. So here we could also put in our authentication token if we had one. And then finally for the body, we have to pass in an object that we stringify, and this object has a query, a property, and a variables property, which are both arguments to the fetch query function. We can now use this environment object in our app.js file, where we are going to replace the relay.store with this relay static environment that we create. And now is also the time to remove the call to inject network layer. And we're basically ready now. We only have to do the last step of the conversion playbook, and that is cleaning up all imports where we were using React Compat or React Classic before. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Removing all the occurrences in our project where we're using React Relay. So I'm doing a project-wide search right here to find and adjust all occurrences of these imports. This is the last one. These were all the adjustments that we had to make in the code. Let's go ahead and call the relay compiler one last time. There we go. We're making sure that all the changes are reflected in the code that the relay compiler generates. So now we can go ahead and run the application one more time. So now the server is running again, and we can head over to our app to see if everything works as expected. So let's try to add a new to-do to our list. There it is. We can also mark our existing to-dos as completed and delete all the to-dos that we have in our list. Finally, we can also go and rename our to-dos. So now we've implemented all the functionality that we had in our application in the first place, but we have migrated our code from the Relay Classic API to Relay Modern. If you want to take a look at the final code, you can simply go to our GraphQL examples repository, and there it is the React Relay to-do example. And in the Modern branch, you can simply take a look at the final version of the code. Hope you enjoyed this video and hope to see you next time.